with various different insects and so on, tested my theoretical ideas about contentment. When you're in jail and you've got no choice, then things like a mug of cold water, which was the only thing that I could choose to have that was a kind of a pleasurable drinking experience because I could buy ice in jail. The mug of cold water became my kind of metaphor for the good life, if you like, right? It was better than a $1,000 bottle of wine.
There was terrible distress amidst that as well.
Of course.
And, if you were being tortured, it would have been a very different...
Yes.
I know it sounds odd to ask that,
Yeah.
but I mean, it was dreadful that you were in there.
Yeah.
But to that extent... Well, were they benign? How would you put it?
Well, I mean, look, I think that 140 people in a cell that's not much bigger than this thing here, where everyone's packed in like sardines, I think that's a form of torture. I think being in a cell when the temperature outside is 100 degrees and the humidity is 80%, that's a kind of torture.
Sure.
I was very lucky, though, because I'm white, because I'm tall, because I'm old, and because I was rich by Cambodian standards, I was able to buy more time out of the cell than other people were. I had family bringing things in for me, so a lot of the very worst aspects of the torture were mitigated by the privileges that accrue to me as being a member of the First World, basically. But I think that in lots of ways that prison situation was torture.
But you didn't think of it like that. That's the interesting thing, did you?
No. Well, I couldn't afford to think of it like that. I had to...
You would have lost hope.
Well, I would have lost hope. But where does despair get you? Despair gets you absolutely nowhere at all. And, of course, that's what all of our ancestors have done since time immemorial. They've had to keep going, and they've had to deal with many more difficult circumstances than I had to deal with. I mean, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandparents, war, depression, famine, that's where we come from. A long line of people that have had to deal with really, really difficult stuff, and they haven't been able to give up hope.
James Ricketson was the second of 5 children. His mother was a physiotherapist, his father a stockbroker. The family lived in Sydney's Rose Bay before it became gentrified.
At the end of Liverpool Street, where we lived, there was a dump. We played in the rubbish dump. That was our playground. We fell off cliffs. We jagged ourselves on barbed wire. We fell off our bicycles, lost a lot of skin. Mum would put some Dettol in a bucket of warm water, wash the dirt off the wound, and then send us back out again, right? This is when kids could be free range. I was christened at St Mark's in Darling Point.
Very famous church.
A famous church. My mother and father were married at St Mark's. I was a Boy Scout at St Mark's. We went there at Easter and christenings and Christmas Day, so we were kind of part-time Christians, but we were brought up with the words ringing in our ears from my mother in particular, but also from Dad, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, right? Which predates Christianity.
The darkest picture of sin, the darkest picture of the human heart that I can paint this afternoon is the cross.
I think you've actually had some spiritual or sort of mystical experiences yourself, haven't you?
Well, when I was 11 years old, so that would have been 1960, my best friend at school's mother was devoutly religious. She went along to a Billy Graham crusade at the Rushcutters Bay Stadium. I went along because I was a friend of Donald's. We sat in the bleachers quite some way back. Billy Graham was on stage, dashingly handsome, young, tall, charismatic. I remember him waving his arms around a bit. But he was certainly very dynamic. And at the end of his talk, he said, all of those present who would like to give their lives to Jesus Christ, come down, come. And there was a choir of 300 people, and they started singing some very inspiring choir, and everybody started flocking down to the front. And I joined in. The hair on the back of my neck was tingling. It was like the first rock concert I'd ever been to, basically. It was wonderful. So I went down, gave my life to Jesus Christ, as did everybody else. And we were each allocated a counsellor. And we could actually write letters to the counsellor and ask certain questions.
We'll find that this has come about through having Christ in our hearts.
And I remember the questions, and one of them was, what happens to children that die before they're old enough to accept Jesus Christ into their lives? Another one was, what happens to people who are mentally impaired and who can't make that kind of decision? And what happens to people who are members of another religion but live in accordance with good Christian values. What happens to them when they die? And his answer to me at the age of 11 was, they go to purgatory. And that wasn't a good answer for me. I thought that there's something fundamentally wrong here. So it didn't wash for me. But I was very curious about matters religious, matters spiritual, which is something that an interest that I've maintained throughout my entire life. I had a couple of very profound experiences in jail, one of which was the cell, when I was in cell block E, they had a trench around the cell block which was just concrete slabs, which is where all the sewerage went. And on top of the 3 concrete slabs there was a kind of a lid. But when it rained and it flooded, it meant that the entire area around the cell block it just had faeces floating in it. And sometimes it came into the cells as well. So you had to walk through this water to get in and out of the cell. Anyhow, there was one particular day when I was at the end of the cell corridor and it had just stopped raining and the cell next to me had water dripping from the eaves into the shitty water. And because of the angle of the sun, the ripples of the water were throwing circles of light up onto the wall. So they meet each other and they create wonderful patterns. So I had this wonderful little kind of light show being thrown up against the wall as a result of the sun shining on these ripples. And it was so beautiful. I mean, it was beautiful in the sense that it brings tears to your eyes. And it was kind of a classic example of how you can find and experience beauty.
It's like rapture.
In any kind of situation.
Gee, this is a fabulous spot, James.
Yes, I'm a very lucky boy.
And this is what you think of as your sacred space?
This is definitely my sacred space, the ocean, the sky, everything that you can see here. But there's one specific place that I think is more sacred, if you like, than others.
So, look, this is just incredibly beautiful, isn't it? Well, these are just amazing.
Well, I've been coming here for the last, 45 years or so.
So, James, I must say this place takes my breath away. Do you feel it as part of the sacredness of this area for you?
Well, I think that all of Palm Beach for me is sacred. This is one of many spots. I love the Angophores because they're so wild and anarchic.
Yes.
And beautiful and don't obey any rules at all in the way that they grow.
Very like you.
That's for you to say, not for me.
Absolutely. The lock doesn't matter, one lock.
The one lock, you see, one lock is not important. We're going to try and maintain the illusion that we haven't broken any locks, that we haven't done anything strictly illegal.
James Ricketson created his first stir in the 1970s. He organised and filmed a tightrope walk between the Sydney Harbour Bridge pylons.
All we've done is sort of forced our way onto property that we really have a right to force our way onto, public property.
In Roslyn and Blagitza, a short film he made exploring multiculturalism, Ricketson's social conscience was emerging.
My mother won't be able to speak to her mother because she comes from a different language, and if she wants to say something but she doesn't know how to say it in Australian, Roslyn's mother won't understand.
Walking Champion of the Year was a film about living with a disability.
I had my first operation when I was 6 weeks old, and then I had 9 more after that. I've been walking for about 2 years.
Blackfellas was his dramatic exploration of Aboriginality, cultural tension and the law. This preoccupation with social justice defines Ricketson's work, a foundation that he believes was set in his childhood. Your mother's whole approach made a big impact on you on her deathbed.
About a week before she died, I took my 15-year-old son to visit, and I said to her, Mum, if there was any one piece of advice that you would give to Jesse to carry him through life, what would it be? She looked at me and smiled, a kind of a beatific smile, looked at Jesse with a beatific smile and said, be kind. That was it. Now, what I take away from that is not just be kind to other people, not just be kind to the planet, if you like, and all that involves, but just as importantly, be kind to yourself. Don't sit in judgment on yourself.
This approach helped James Ricketson not only survive terrible jail conditions, but also to spend his time there contemplating, of all things, happiness. So what's this book?
Well, this is the book of notes that I made sitting on an upturned bucket in the bathroom of Presar Prison.
Right.
Basically wisdom of the ages. Epicurus, Diogenes, Socrates, Shakespeare.
Right.
There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. I mean, that is just so
It's
good,
breathtaking, isn't it?
really.
It's so clever.
You know, and Aristotle, happiness depends on ourselves. I mean, they're all like 4, 5, 6 words, and yet they say so much, you know. I found myself getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and using the only lit room in the cell, which was the loo, the bathroom, which had 3 squat toilets and a narrow trench for peeing in, a kind of a urinal for peeing in. And I would upturn a bucket that I had, that I washed my clothes in, and I'd sit on that at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'd make notes or write letters to my family or so on. And there was one particular occasion when one of the early risers came in and stood beside me and had a pee, and some of his pee splashed onto my leg. And my immediate response was, oh God, I've got to wash it off. And then I thought, well, why have I got to wash it off? What's wrong with his pee? It's not going to hurt me. And so I kind of carried on. These are the letters that I smuggled out of Presar Prison. What I did was I folded them up like this, like this. I'd have about 15, 20 pages, and I'd lie on them overnight. I'd compress them so that it was a little brick. And there was one part of my anatomy that the guards never ever checked because they were very discreet, and that was kind of between my legs. I'll just leave it at that. So there'd be this little parcel there. Then when I arrived at the visiting area, and I would have taken it out by then, I'd shake hands with my son, with Jesse, so like that, and then give him a hug, and then while we were hugging, he'd kind of put... So that was how we smuggled
Ingenious.
Notes out.
John le Carre, come on down.
Well, there was a lot about my prison experience that was like a Jean le Carre novel, yeah. I think that one of the things that sacred spaces do for all of us, whatever that sacred space might be, is induce a sense of peace, calm, contentment, and just feeling at home in the world, which is one of the loveliest feelings that you can have in life.
Does it make you feel small in the world, or in control of it?
I actually think that feeling small in the world is a wonderful thing, because it teaches you or induces in you a certain kind of humility. You realise that you are just one speck of sand in a huge macrocosm, if you like, and there's something very comforting in that. I don't find it at all threatening or distressing to think that I'm small and of no significance at all.
Do you really mean that?
Yeah, absolutely. I find it extraordinarily comforting, actually.
And when you sit in an exquisite place like this, do your thoughts turn to any form of higher power or numinous being or God? Do they or not?
I think that sacred spaces, such as they are, reside within our breast, speaking metaphorically, and that the sacred space, or the kind of axis mundi, I think is the expression for it, is wherever you happen to be. And so I can understand in my own kind of Western, rational, logical way why and how it is that Aboriginal people would come to a place like this and feel an intense love and connection to it. And I think that we non-Aboriginals are capable of that, you know, and anybody that goes into a church knows that. And I think that we always need to keep that in mind, that the original inhabitants of this continent have had thousands of years of this deep relationship with the land that we can kind of skim the surface of in our own experiences.
This was their cathedral.
Exactly. Oh, look at this.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, of course, that's what you referenced in Women of the Sun, wasn't it?
Well, back in 1982, I was invited to direct the first episode of Women of the Sun, which is called A Lint of the Flame. And it was the story of the first contact between white men and Aboriginals early in the 19th century. Told from the point of view of a young Aboriginal girl called Alinta, who was then a teenager. It was my very great privilege to be able to work with people from Lake Bella. So in consultation with the community itself, Bob Weiss, the producer, and I produced an episode that provides a glimpse anyway into what life would have been like for tribal people before white men arrived.
What did you learn from them?
Well, I learned that they have the kind of connection to the land that I feel I've had glimpses of, right? And so if I magnify the feelings that I have about the area that we're in now, which I love, and if somebody came along with a bulldozer and said, look, we're going to chop these trees down and put up a hotel because that way the council can raise $100 million I would be weeping, first of all, as they do, for the loss of what for them is very sacred and what for me is a little bit sacred, if you like. So I'd be fighting tooth and nail.
Tell me about your current project on happiness.
Well, because I was curious about the subject of happiness and because I'd actually had my own experiences with happiness, I thought, well, why not pursue it a bit further and see if there's either a podcast series to be made or maybe a TV series. And my first foray into the subject was to travel to Bhutan, which I did earlier this year, which is famous for its gross national happiness
Index,
and to see whether that was just a public relations stunt or whether there was some truth to it. And there is, in fact, a lot of truth to it. I've then noticed that New Zealand is also beginning to talk about integrating people's happiness into their plans for the future. I think it's a subject that can be explored in so many different ways because there are so many different ways in which people search for and often fail to find happiness. Oh, dear.
I have read that you're very impulsive.
Well, most of the really good things that have happened to me in my life have been as a result of serendipity and impulse combined. Things happened, like I met Jessie's mother serendipitously as a result of a wrong phone number. 3 hours later, I'm head over heels in love with her, and having never really thought about having children up to that point, I was 32 years old, decided that I would like to have a child with her. And so when she alerted me to the fact that a child could be imminent in 9 months unless we were very careful, I said, well, I don't mind because I'd love to have a child with you. So that was very impulsive, and I wound up with a beautiful son, and I don't regret doing that. So there's a time to act impulsively. But I think, interestingly, that when you act on impulse, it isn't something that's completely arbitrary. I think that there's a kind of a deep-seated knowledge that you have of what is right and appropriate and what's wrong. And so I think all of the best things that I've done in my life, all the major turning points in my life have been as the result of impulsive actions. And every now and then I've got myself into strife, like going to jail, but basically nothing but good has come from being impulsive.
He believes Roxanne needs a family life.
Among other impulsive decisions James Ricketson's made was fostering his daughter Roxanne.
Cambodia continues to woo a breakaway Khmer.
8 years later, on a visit to Cambodia, he was struck by the number of street kids, and rather than ignore them, James tried to help. He made the film Sleeping with Cambodia, which led to a lifelong friendship with one of those street kids.
This is Shanti 20 years after I met. She's 28. And what I was saying to you before about laughing, I mean, look at that laughter. I mean, she's such a happy woman. And she's now got 9 children. And she's like that all the time. She's 32 years old with 9 children.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And she calls me Papa. So she's my Cambodian daughter, and I've got 9 Cambodian grandchildren.
Will you go back to Cambodia? Do you want to?
Yeah, I want to go back to Cambodia, and I will go back to Cambodia.
Will you be allowed in?
Yes, I will. Let me just try and make
You
that all
think.
one statement. For the last year, I've been making overtures to the Cambodian government and to the Cambodian embassy to get permission to go back. I feel that I'm probably pretty safe if I play my cards right, if I don't get involved in politics, which I don't want to do.
Will you definitely pull back from that now?
Well, but the thing is that I was never involved in politics except in the sense that I was a filmmaker. In the same way that I'm sure you've done a lot of filming with members of this party and that party and this sect and that sect. So I'm not going to get involved in politics. I was never really involved in politics, but I covered a lot of politics. I certainly had my own preferences. If I go back there with money, which I've now got as a result of my being in jail, and build houses...
Sorry, what do you mean?
Well, before I got out of jail, I knew that I was going to experience my 15 minutes of fame. This has all happened so fast. This time 2 days ago I was in jail, and now I am being confronted by a wall of media. And I thought, rather than just enjoy it, why not put it to some good use? And so I and members of my family started up an organisation called Family by Family, the intention of which was to raise money to buy houses for poor families.
Poor Cambodian families.
Poor Cambodian families. I'd already done that. I'd already extricated one family from the rubbish dump and bought them a house and so on. So I wanted to do more of that. And so we set up this thing called Family by Family, and we raised $42,000, which I can then direct to the buying of houses for families in Cambodia, and thereby give the children an opportunity to go to school and possibly live much better lives than their parents lived.
Why does this matter to you so much?
I understand why you ask it that way, but I think the more interesting question is, what do I get out of it, in a way? It's not so much that it matters. So what do I get out of it? Well, it makes me happy, for starters. I mean, I've been on a little bit of a high the last few days, knowing, and I've already transferred the money, and the building is commencing this week, and it's all been documented. By about March, there'll be 12 families that have got houses. And even though I don't know these people, and I'll probably never meet them, it makes me happy to think that I've been able to kind of pass on something positive as a result of an experience which I guess you could term as negative. But I have been doing that on and off in different ways for a long time now. And I think that, I mean, the way I answer that question is to ask a question, which is more enjoyable at Christmas time, the giving of a present to somebody and seeing their reaction when they open the present, or the receiving of a present. And so giving something to somebody, doing something for somebody, being generous towards somebody, being kind towards somebody, is its own reward. It makes you feel good.
And is it contentment or is it happiness? I think there is a difference.
Well, I struggle a lot with both the word happiness and with the word contentment, because everybody's idea of happiness is different. But I think contentment is being happy with where you are under almost any circumstance.
Well, James Ricketson, it's been a great privilege to sit here with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, it's been a great privilege to sit here with you also.